Hello and welcome. My name is Ryan Little. I'm an AWS Educate Technical Program Manager. And today we're going to walk through a step-by-step tutorial on using Amazon S3 to launch a static website via the AWS Educate classrooms. So this particular tutorial is really geared towards, I would say, educators at institutions that are looking to run these Educate classrooms for your students. We'll look at this experience through the eyes of a student as well as through the eyes of an educator towards the end of it. Some of the goals for this tutorial really are to give you a high-level overview of Amazon S3, what it is and what that service does. I'll give you a brief introduction to the AWS Management Console, which is effectively the homepage for the AWS experience. As I said, we'll walk through the creation of a static website through the eyes of a student in classrooms. We'll look at creating, configuring, provisioning, and effectively launching the bucket within S3, which is effectively a repository, and uploading files or what we call objects into those buckets. And then towards the end of the tutorial, we'll view this maybe student experience as an educator to see how the student did in the creation of their classroom experience, or we could think of it as using this appearing into their environment maybe as troubleshooting or assisting them along the way as well. So before we kick off into the tutorial itself, I do want to give you a kind of a quick primer on Amazon S3. It's actually one of our oldest services at AWS. AWS has been in the business since 2006. This service launched in that year. And Amazon S3, which stands for Simple Storage Service, is really an object storage service that offers industry-leading scalability, data availability, security, and performance. This means that many of our customers of all shapes and sizes and industries can use it to store and protect any amount of data for a different range of use cases. It could be for websites, mobile applications, backup and restore, which many of our customers use it for. And even if you want to integrate into IoT devices or big data analytics, you can do so. Amazon S3 provides an easy-to-use management features associated to the service as well, so you can organize your data and configure finely tuned access controls to meet your specific business or organizational requirements. S3 is designed for 11 nines of durability. And it's think of it almost as like a regional service, and we'll talk about regions a little bit later. And it stores data for millions of applications for companies all around the world. So I will highlight four key customers that are using Amazon S3. The first, of course, is Netflix, one of our earliest customers. They're delivering billions of hours of content via Amazon S3 to their customers around the world. They also use S3 as a data lake for their big data and analytics solutions. Another company is called FINRA, which is a financial regulatory body in the US. They use S3 to ingest and store data for over 75 billion market events daily. Of course, there's Airbnb, who are using Amazon S3 for backup data and also for static files, which we'll look at as well for our static website. They have over 10 petabytes of user pictures on Airbnb that are stored in Amazon S3. And then finally, GE, General Electric, who uses Amazon S3 to store and protect a petabyte of critical medical imaging data for its health cloud service. So you'll see, as it mentions, a wide variety of customers of all around the world, of all shapes and sizes, leveraging this as a storage service on top of AWS. We see a lot of common use cases for Amazon S3 as well. So for backup and storage, application hosting, which we'll do for our static website, media hosting, and even software delivery, if you're building out those software applications. So lots of different use cases, integrating nicely in different hybrid environments too. So you can imagine maybe even having a corporate data center that links up to S3 for disaster recovery, for example. Okay, so those are our just quick highlights on S3. I do want to go over, going back into the tutorial now, of what we're going to talk about. And really what we're doing is building out a static website. So if you think of kind of static or straight HTML, CSS files that live in that space, and others, you'll be able to build out those kind of solutions. So typically static content that's not going to change over time. We do have some dynamic capability too. So if you leverage services like CloudFront, that can store static and dynamic content. So you can think of maybe an e-commerce site that's looking to update, or a sports website that gives you updates on sports or preferences for your use cases. There's a number of use case and configurations you can make. But for our purposes, the static website, we're going to follow more or less these 7 steps. This is from the AWS S3 developer guide, which you can do a quick Google search for. And then under example walkthroughs, look for where it says configuring a static website. And we're effectively going to walk through some of these steps here for you today. And excuse me, and I'm just going to get my notes. And the very first thing that we're going to do is actually we're going to go into S3 via the AWS Educate portal. So that's the very first thing that we're going to do. And I have access to the portal currently. I should also point out, in addition to this developer guide, we also have an AWS white paper specifically for hosting static websites, which is publicly available. I'll try to make this documentation available to you as well. And you'll see here, I'm actually logged in as a student in AWS Educate. So if you, as an educator, if you've created a classroom for your students, students can access the classroom by the My Classrooms tab up here, or they can scroll down a bit and click on that link. There's a number of classrooms that this student has access to. Some I've already been granted access myself. I've accepted the invitation. Once I do that, it turns blue. For other classroom sessions, if I haven't yet accepted the invite, I do need to accept or decline that classroom invite. And you'll see here, it gives me also the credit allowance for that classroom experience, and then the course completion date. So I want to make sure that I use the credit that's allowed for me as a student before this end date, and for you as an educator to determine when that end date will be. Typically, it's based on a semester type, so anywhere between maybe 3 months or 6 months in that space. We usually don't go longer than that in building out classroom experiences for our students. So I'm going to click on Go to Classroom. And this redirects me to a third-party site called Vocarium, which is used to host our AWS Educate experience for our students and educators. And you'll see here that on the left, I have a listing of frequently asked questions. I have the number of remaining credits available to me as a student. And I'm able to access AWS via this AWS console. And that's a very important piece, and that's we'll see this page a little bit later as an educator as well. So this is where your students will enter AWS Management Console. And I'm waiting for this pop-up window to come up. And what it's doing is it's actually automatically authenticating me as a user based on the classroom credentials that have been created for me and my educator has created for me. So I didn't have to, if you noticed in that authentication, I didn't have to input any username or password or anything like that. So I'm now in the AWS Management Console. And one of the very first things I want to highlight for AWS Educate users is this idea of a region. Okay, so you'll hear this word a lot in AWS. A region is a geographic area somewhere in the world. And usually it's denoted by a city or country name. So in this case, Northern Virginia, which is one of our oldest regions in the US, and actually one of the oldest regions for AWS. For AWS Educate users, this will be currently the only region where users can build on AWS. We have 22 around the world, but if you're building on top of AWS Educate and you're using classrooms, this is where we want our students to be, and us as educators as well. So just remember that and highlight that to your students for them in their building. If they go to other regions, they're more likely than not going to get some sort of access denied. So if I shoot over to Oregon, it'll look like I have access to this resource, but if I click on any of the services here, it will effectively give me an access denied if I attempt to go any further. So we want to try to not to do that for our students. So make sure that they stay in Northern Virginia or US East 1. Okay, so I'm back in Northern Virginia. I'm going to click on AWS icon up here, and it brings me back to the home page. That's the first thing, is this idea of region. The next thing I want to highlight is the service capability. Okay, so we have over 175 plus services on top of the AWS platform. As an Educate member, I don't have access to all of those services, but a great deal of them I do. And I can find out a listing via the FAQ page. I have a listing of services that are supported. So if I'm looking for a particular service like S3, I can go to the search bar and type in S3 and get a link to that service. Similarly, I can find it through my recently visited services if I've been there recently. I can go up to the top here for services. I get a drop down of all the services in this region with a nice search bar as well. Or I can click on all services and get another drop down here for myself. So whatever avenue you use to search for the services, you'll find particularly helpful for you there. So for our purposes, I'm going to start with S3, right? So we said we're going to be building out a static website. And so S3 is going to be our predominant service here for this tutorial. And you'll see that it'll redirect to the S3 service. I'm now in Amazon S3. And this is where I just want to take a quick pause and just talk about at a high level again what we're trying to do. We're building out effectively a static web page. Okay, so when we talk about kind of what that means in our environments, we want to give some sort of context to that. Okay, so from an AWS perspective, when we talk about a static website hosting, what exactly are we saying? And for our purposes today, we're talking about the simplest form of website architecture here. So a static website where users are served static content. Okay, that could be HTML, that could be images, that could be video, JavaScript, style sheets, and so on. So you can think of things like brand microsites, marketing websites, intranet information pages. So static websites are really straightforward in the sense that it's very easy to build and get up and running. Architecturally speaking, though, we want to think about how we manage those environments too if we grow and scale over time. That's another conversation for another time, but that's something that we want to highlight if you're looking into building out kind of larger cloud environments. So a static website delivers content in the same format in which it's stored. Okay, so HTML and others. So I have some examples of that here. So you can think of maybe a static website like this which hosts an event. I think this is a PDF that's being rendered in this environment. It could be another page like this for some other event that you're outlining for your institution. It gives contact information for its users so they can go there to request more information. Or if you just want to kind of put a nameplate on an event or activity that you want to highlight. It could be a video that you want to host. So in this case, maybe an AWS Educate video or a video that you want your students to upload in this environment. Or it could be an index.html, which looks like this. Under the hood, it's leveraging, it's bootstrapped with some CSS and some other capabilities here as well as imaging. So having interactive site like this that your students can build up. So a really basic web page to get going. So we'll look at examples of all of these, and all of these are effectively static websites. They each are given a unique endpoint, and I'll talk to you about how that is done on top of S3. Okay, so we're going to start with building out our S3 environment, and everything starts with a creation of a bucket. Okay, and so that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to click on that Create Bucket link, and a bucket here effectively is a repository. We have to have a globally unique name for a bucket, so we have to think about what alphanumeric combination we want to use that no one else in the world has. I will try this. I don't know if it's taken already, but I can say maybe my static website, and then maybe my initials at the end. Okay. You'll notice I use hyphen. If I use underscore, I'm probably going to get some sort of an error. Yeah. So it'll say here, the bucket name contains invalid characters. So just keep that in mind. No underscores, no capital letters. We want to stay in US East, Northern Virginia, or US East 1. And here talks about public access. We're going to come back to this, but just know that every service on AWS is closed by default. We operate, as many environments do, we grant least privilege. So unless you have the express permissions to augment or configure or change that service or feature, you would be normally denied access to that. So as users of this environment, we do have access and permissions to either block or unblock public access, and we'll come back to that piece a little bit later. So just waiting a moment here for my bucket to be created. Okay, and we see that my bucket was successfully created, which is great news. You'll see that there's no objects in my bucket as of yet, so I'm going to upload some objects or files here for that. We're also going to look at this static website hosting here. So you'll see it has a unique endpoint of which we can add an index.html or an error document if we wanted to. We'll come back to that a little bit later. The permissions page, which will also unblock as and when we want public access, and there's a number of ways to do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to upload some objects to this bucket. Okay, so I'm going to just take a sampling of some of these objects here. So you'll see some are HTML, some are PDF. There's a video in here as well. There's a JSON. I'll upload those. And I'll see those start to populate in my bucket. And this assets folder has about 40 plus objects inside. So I'm going to make sure that I choose this assets folder and click and drag that into my upload page and click on upload. And I'll wait a few seconds for that to come in, and that'll be populated by the CSS and other files that I have in there. And so if you see all of these, you'll notice they have the name that I have given to each of these objects. And so the naming convention is going to be important later. We'll talk about and how you utilize that, which is referred to as the key here. We said everything is closed by default on AWS. So if I go to the object URL for this particular object, you'll see that I get an access denied. And that's because I haven't yet opened up permissions for the objects or for this bucket. Now, there's a number of ways I can do that. I can usually I'll be able to click on this make public link up here. But because at a bucket level, I haven't opened up the ability to, oops, there we go. If I go up to permissions here, I need to open up this bucket to even allow for those objects to be rendered public. And I do that vis-a-vis the block public access link up here. And you'll see here it says use AWS S3, sorry, Amazon S3 block public access settings to control the settings that allow public access to your data. Well, we want to build out a static website, and we want that to be public on some level. We can do that at a bucket level for all the objects in our bucket, or we could do that at a per object level. So like the that particular object that was we saw the access denied for earlier. First, we have to give permission for that bucket to render public objects. Okay, so one of the ways we do that is we unblock this all public access check. So you'll see here it's automatically checked for us. We're going to unblock that, which gives now this bucket the ability, and we have to confirm that. It gives this bucket the ability to have objects be made public. And we'll see here if I go back out a step on this page, now these objects can be public, whereas before they couldn't be by default. So I go back into my bucket. I go to this the hi.gif that I have, object URL. And I click on that, and you'll notice again, I still have this access denied. Okay, so all I've really done here is just said, yes, this bucket may be public, and the objects within this bucket may be public, but they actually haven't yet been public. So it's another step that I have to follow here. Now you'll see this make public link is made available to me. I can click on that here to make this object public. I can go up to permissions, public access everyone, and also make sure everyone can read this object. It says now that you've clicked on this, everyone will have access to this, public access to this object. I can do it that way and save. And there's yet another way, which is if I go out to the bucket level, I can click on this particular object and go down to actions and go down to make public. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to make public this particular object. And if I go back to my link, the URL that was given for that object, I should be able to see it now. And you'll see this little character waving hello. And so I know that that now works. So this is publicly available now to anyone in the world. If they have this URL, they can access that particular object. Okay, so that's just a high level on permissions. There's a lot more granularity that we can have and build out in this environment. I do want to highlight a few other permissions that are available here. So on a bucket level, if I want to access, and be very careful about giving bucket level permission, which means all objects in that bucket are now viewable to the world. Right? We want to be very mindful about that as and when we build. Occasionally, or sometimes you might hear about users that have open S3 buckets. So we want to try to limit that as much as possible, unless it needs to be defined in a public space. My recommendation would be to use a per object permission or pre-signed URLs for S3. But there's documentation here that supports opening up bucket access and making buckets public. You can follow the documentation here and on how to do that. But for our purposes, I just want to focus on actually, I'm going to make all of these, since we're there, I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to click on all the objects in my bucket, go up to action, and click on make public. Okay, so I can see all of these objects now are made public for me, which is wonderful. And if I want to test that out, I can pick one of these. So let me pick maybe the school flyer PDF. And usually what I do is just I copy the key name for that particular object. I go to properties. I click on static website hosting. Just waiting for that to load here. So let me do a quick reload of that. Now you'll see the static website. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I was just talking about under properties in S3, the static website hosting. And so what I am going to do is just copy this school flyer PDF, go to properties, click on static website hosting, and you'll see that it's already in a disable website hosting state, which is the default state. We said everything is closed by default on AWS unless you have the express permissions. I do have the permissions to augment this, so I'm going to say use this bucket to host a website. I could include an index.html or in this case a PDF. I'm going to go ahead and save that PDF, and so now you'll see that it says bucket hosting on this page. I can actually click on this endpoint, and you'll see the page that is rendered here for our purposes today. Now, and you can kind of play around with these objects a little bit and say maybe I want to look at a video. I want my students to create a video, talk about that experience on AWS, creating a bucket, and launching that video as a static page in that environment. So I can upload this video property as a static object, save that. And then if I click on endpoint, it should redirect me. It might take a couple seconds to update. If you don't see it right away, you can go ahead and refresh your page and you'll see that video populate. But what I want to try to do is get to, this page, and that's my index.html file effectively. So that's what I'm looking for here. So I'm going to go back into my bucket. And I'm going to click on index.html. I'm going to copy that name. I'm going to go back out to the bucket level, properties, static website hosting, and I'm going to upload that HTML file and save. And then if I click on endpoint again, I should get a page that looks like the page I was looking for. Now, another added step that you can do for your students is if you give them this index.html and you want them to augment it with their favorite editor of choice, they can go ahead and do that. So for that step, all you would need to do, and I'll just pull this page out here. All you need to do is drag your index.html into your favorite IDE. And I use Sublime for mine, and if I make this a little bit bigger, you'll see what it looks like. And this is just the HTML that is associated with that file. Welcome to AWS Educate, and then you have some prompts here, and I could augment that and say something like I can say something like this. Okay, and I'll save that here. I'll save that file here, and then I'm going to go back into my S3 console. I'm going to go up to Overview. I'm going to go to Upload, Add Files, and I'll click on that updated index.html that I have. I'll choose that file, and it's automatically, well, not automatically, but once I hit Upload, it'll update this index.html, whatever the previous version was. Now, if I don't have versioning enabled, it's going to kind of write over whatever that previous version or object was. If I do have versioning enabled, I can go back to the previous index.html or the new one. I'll have some options there. But for our purposes today, we're not going to play around with versioning. I'm going to go ahead and click on that object. I'm going to make it public. And from here, we're just going to test this out. I'm going to go to Properties, Static Website Hosting. I have the index.html here. I'm just going to save again to be sure. And then click on this endpoint. And hopefully we'll see that updated. As I go to our refresh, you'll see the updated text that is has replaced it. So that can be a nice added activity that you can do with your students. It can be a static page. It can be a video that they upload, all sorts of things. So I wanted to make that kind of accessible for you as educators. The next thing I want to do is effectively I want to disable and actually terminate resources here. But instead of doing that as a student, and normally what I would do is as a student, I'd have to delete all these objects here, and then I would have to go out to the S3 level and then delete my bucket and make sure I delete my bucket. It'll ask me first to empty all assets inside and then to write the bucket name and then delete bucket. That's a best practice. I thought I might do that as an educator now if I want to go in and help maybe my students having difficulty deleting their bucket. So what I'm going to do here is go to sign out of the console. I'm going to leave that page. So I'm here in a student page. I'm going to log out as a student, go back to AWS Educate, sign in as an educator. I'm going to go to classrooms, to the classroom that I've created. And I'm going to go to my classrooms. And I believe it's this one here that I've created for my students. So I'm going to click on that. And it's going to, as you'll see in a moment, give me a very similar type of view as the students' view we had earlier. It'll be slightly different here in that I can get a drop down of all my students that I've registered for this classroom. But if I wanted to look at the student that just created the static website, I can find their email address here. I can go to the work area, that student's work area. And then it's from here, I'll see effectively the same page that our students saw earlier. And then I want to peer in to see what they're doing. This student is actually having difficulty deleting their bucket. So I'm going in as an educator now into their console. And I'll enter that management console. I can go to their S3, Amazon S3 page or the service. I can see that they've created the bucket, which is good. If I drill down into that, I can look at the properties. Did they create a static website? Okay, I can see that they have index.html. I can verify that with the endpoint and get the endpoint and see the endpoint is running that that static page, which is very good. And so I know that effectively they've completed all the steps here, which is wonderful. But what I want to do now is help this student with deleting resources. We said that we want to try to minimize the costs on credits associated to these classrooms as much as possible. I see that the students completed the exercise, so now I want to help them delete. So I can do individually or select all and go to Actions, Delete, and to verify that all of these objects will be deleted. And you'll see there that they're now removed from the bucket. I go out at a bucket level again in my S3 environment. And from here, I can click on the circle, go to delete, and I'm going to copy the bucket name, the name that I created earlier, and paste that in here. Again, it's another step that AWS has added to confirm deletion of the bucket. Are you sure you want to delete this bucket? Yes, we are sure. We're positive. We don't want to incur any additional storage costs here if we don't need to. And then I'm going to go to delete bucket. And then you'll see that the bucket is successfully deleted from the student's account. Okay. So that wraps up our tutorial on using Amazon S3 to launch a static website via Classrooms. I will highlight this page again, Amazon S3 public page, if you're looking for more information about this particular service and what it does, as well as the Getting Started tutorials I can recommend for you. This deals with all sorts of has all sorts of added information here on 10-minute tutorials, some additional webinars, and some step-by-step guides. This one might prove to be really helpful in the future for you. And then there's also, of course, this AWS white paper for hosting static websites. So all of that information, hopefully you can find a value in the future. I thank you for your time today. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. My name is Ryan Little, and I will see you again in a future AWS session.